While I was there, this magazine, the podcast magazine, was kind of floating around. And so I think I got a free copy in a swag bag or something. And so I looked at it and I was like, this is pretty interesting. I'll see if there's, if independent women podcasters are represented and how they're represented. And so a few months went by and I checked on their website and, I'm seeing like Katie Couric on the cover and all of these celebrities on the cover. And I was like, well, that's unfortunate because I was hoping that this magazine would be more representative of independent podcasters, whether men or women. But I really felt that the magazine was not what I had hoped it to be. And so I'm kind of thinking about it, and that creative thought comes into my head. And it was like, well, you're just going to have to create a magazine yourself.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak. Is the issue of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the gloves?
A second wave is...
We all need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand.
From Santa Rosa, California, this is 19 Stories. I'm Cheryl Halling. The guest joining me today, Kathy Barron, is a fellow Bay Area resident and the founder and editor-in-chief of the Women Who Podcast magazine, a publication that celebrates independent women podcasters from all over the world. I'm delighted to have recently discovered this online publication, especially since Kathy and her team just celebrated their second year in publication. Women Who Podcast magazine is a fantastic place to discover new podcasts and podcasters, and Kathy strives for it to be a forum for fans and hosts to reach out to one another for support, collaboration, and inspiration. Her hope is that together they can fulfill the vision she has for a shared future, including scholarships, mentorships, annual conferences, and an expanded learning community. As Kathy's mission is to lift up independent women podcast voices and give them the accolades they deserve. She may know a thing or two about what that would mean to women podcasters, given she has been the host and producer of the Women Who Sarcast podcast since its launch in April of 2018. Women Who Sarcast podcast aims to change the misconception of sarcasm, something we'll definitely be chatting about in this episode. So let's jump in by welcoming Kathy Barron to 19 Stories.
Thank you, Cheryl. I mean, that was quite the intro. I'm going to have to put that on rewind in a loop every morning when I get up in the morning so I can how they have that picture of, someone standing there like a superhero with their arms up, so I can listen to that every morning when I get up to start my day.
Well, hey, we all need to be reminded that we're doing our thing, and sometimes we're in the midst of it. We forget, right? You are a superhero, and thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm well, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be talking with you.
I am so glad we're finally connecting, as we've had to reschedule a couple of times, and yet here we are recording your episode on what is the third anniversary/birthday of 19 Stories. So welcome to my party.
And congratulations. That's an amazing feat, and you should be very proud. Not only proud that you've made it 3 years, but proud for actually taking that initial leap to even create the podcast. It takes a lot of courage, I think, for women sometimes to actually press the record button for the first time.
Don't you know it? And thank you so much. I appreciate that. When you look at the number of episodes I have, it really, if I was consistent and putting them out on a weekly basis, it really equals to 1 year. But I'm defining consistency as being someone who just keeps showing up. As you know, and we'll get into it, it's hard sometimes. It's hard to keep showing up doing your podcast. So we'll talk about all of the things, but I receive that, and I thank you so much for saying that. And Kathy, in doing a bit of research on you, I realized that we may have met actually in person, or certainly have crossed paths, as it turns out that we were both at the She Podcast Live conference in October of 2021.
Oh, in Scottsdale.
in Scottsdale. How
Yes.
crazy is that?
Yeah. And I'm sure we passed in the hall, I'm sure at some point or another.
I was working the check-in table because I was actually doing some work with Jessica and Elsie and helping them for that particular
Okay.
conference. And you may have come up to the table because you were a speaker. And so, of course, we had the speaker swag bags. And because the first time I saw your picture, I'm like, something tells me I have
Yeah.
seen her before. And then when I realized that your session was titled Compelling Conversation Strategies for Conducting Exceptional Interviews, I wanted to attend that, and yet it conflicted with my schedule for that day. So,
Mhm.
given your subject matter, I do hope I do your topic justice today with our conversation.
Well, so far you're doing great, so I might learn something from you.
Well, actually, it's about you today. So hopefully we'll learn something from each other and hopefully there'll be some nuggets for our listeners to take away. So I always love to start out talking about the inspiration of someone moving in a particular direction or starting a particular endeavor. But before we do that, I'd love to know what you did before you got into podcasting, as I came across, in fact, I think it was the delightful picture of you that you used for She Podcasts Live. You were at a mic, you had headphones, and you had a beautiful stand-up bass behind you. So I wonder if I'm also speaking with a classical or a jazz musician.
Unfortunately, I did not have that talent growing up. I'm definitely not musically inclined at all. That actually belonged to a friend of mine, Shaylani, who we did an episode called Breaking It Down with Shaylani. And she no longer does the podcast with me a couple of years now. But that was in her place. She's very talented, pianist, singer. So, unfortunately, no, I was not given that gift of music, although my nephew is a great musician. So, it must have skipped a generation because I'm like, I don't know where he got it from. Definitely not my sister. But no, I definitely was not in music. I did in seventh grade, I did try out for the band and I wanted to play clarinet. And to this day, I still remember the music teacher telling me that I was not smart enough to be playing the clarinet. Like I failed the test or whatever. They give you some written test or something.
They actually said
So,
intelligent or smart or not smart
yeah, I'm
enough.
just not smart enough to play the clarinet. So, my dreams of becoming a rock star were definitely.
I'm only laughing because how many rock star clarinetists do you know? Oh my god. Well, first of all, I'm really sorry that happened because I gotta tell you, when I hear of professors or teachers saying that, now obviously an aptitude helps, but to tell someone you're not smart enough or intelligent enough, as if you wouldn't be able, I mean, that's why you learn, right?
Right, and I'm in seventh grade,
Oh
so
my
it's
gosh.
not like I'm trying out for the orchestra.
Philharmonic.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
So
Well, I'm super curious about an admission that you made when you were interviewed by Jen Hardy. As I said, I've been listening to not only your podcast, but things you've been guesting on. That you were interviewed by Jen Hardy on her podcast, Fabulous Over 50, where you said that, and correct me if I'm wrong, you don't listen to podcasts and you really don't like talking a lot.
mhm.
That statement caused me to, it's like the old pinball machines, tilt, tilt, tilt.
Right.
Because it begs the question, what attracted you to podcasting in the first place?
Well, I have a degree in video production. So my profile for art school was documentary films. I
Mm.
love documentary films and I love creating documentary films because I love to hear other people tell their stories. And that's kind of where podcasting kind of came in. It wasn't in my 10-year plan to start a podcast. It just, like with a lot of podcasters, it just happened. But I think as it evolved, it kind of became this mini documentary, audio. With the first episode, I have a guest on and I interview the guest. And then, the second episode of the month is with Corey, my co host. And then the third episode is called Real Deep Shit. And that's for me only. I created that episode to get me out of my comfort zone because I'm not someone that can just sit down and ramble for 30 minutes. I don't like small talk. I I'm a Scorpio, so we like to go deep. We like to have deep conversations. And so for me to sit behind the mic by myself is really hard for me. And it's still a challenge, but I force myself to do it because I know that I have things that I want to say, but I tend to talk in circles a lot. So I definitely have to write things down for that episode so that I can stay on track and get my point across, because I am the type of person when I do have something to say, it's not always a gold nugget, but it's definitely something worth saying. I'm not just going to talk because I like to hear myself talk. And my dad was in radio, so I know that I have some of his DNA as well. So I think knowing that he was in radio kind of naturally came into doing a podcast.
Tell us about your dad for a moment. Where was he in radio at? What market?
He was in Mason City, Iowa. He did some radio in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I believe. I wasn't born yet. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. So by the
Wow,
time it
6.
came to me, we moved to Ticonderoga, New York, where I was born. And then he actually managed the little radio station in Thai. And he ended up having to quit because it was just too much stress for him. And physically, he was having angina attacks and stress.
Oh, no.
And, it was just not a good thing. But in Mason City, Iowa, when he was in the Midwest, he would always be introduced by Walter Cronkite because he would come on after Walter.
Seriously?
Yeah. So Walter would introduce
Wow.
my dad for the local news, which
How
was
cool.
really
I
cool.
mean, how many people get to say that? That's fantastic.
Yeah, so that was really cool. And my dad had the voice. He had the radio voice, similar to like you. And, he just really excelled at it.
I don't think I've ever met anybody who can have that claim to fame. That's very, very cool. So you said you do documentary films, which I find fascinating that the analogy to, podcasting, telling the stories, the audio story, because that's how I feel about podcasting. And there's so many people who are implementing or just using video, doing, I still don't know what to call them, video casting, because to me it's a interview on camera, but they're podcasts of sorts. But to me, the whole idea of listening to someone and allowing the stories that they're either telling or they and their guests are unfolding for the listener, to me, that is a documentary. And I love that format. So how cool that you transitioned into that, or are you still doing documentary films?
I'm not. No, it's been quite a while since I've done that. And usually they're just shorts. When I lived in Seattle, when I went to art school in Seattle, I worked for a production company and we did a documentary on Pike Place Market. And that was really a cool project to be part of because we interviewed the parents and the grandparents and the kids. So it's like generation after generation of artisans that sell their wares at Pike Place Market. It's like this 25, 50 years of generations that continually, kids are born in Pike Place Market.
It's a very cool venue. The one and only time I was there, I just was in awe and just saying, what a beautiful outdoor market. And just to watch everybody, the fishmongers, is that what you call it?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the buskers. And
Yes. So, and then to go to the original Big Bucks there, that was pretty cool. The original Starbucks, to be there where the supposedly, and I'm being very facetious, but birthplace of coffee, at least for the Pacific Northwest. So I have to say, I've been listening, as I've said, I've been listening to some of the Women Who Sarcast podcast. And given the episodes I've listened to have had really inspiring messages, I'm curious why you chose that name, because it's almost a misnomer when I'm getting these wonderful pearls of wisdom listening to your podcast. And I'm thinking, I don't find it sarcastic. So what is your different take on sarcasm then?
Well, I think originally the Women Who Sarcast podcast came about because it was me and another friend who was also very sarcastic that started the podcast. So that was the name that we came up with. And unfortunately, 4 or 5 months into it, she wasn't able to continue doing the podcast with me. So that's when I had my comedian friend Mario come in for a few months just to kind of help me out. And then that's when it kind of evolved into this format that I have currently. So I kept the name, and it's interesting because every quote unquote season, because I'm not really a seasonal podcast, I would be like, okay, I don't want to go into the self-help stuff. I want to have it like a fun, it's more sarcastic, but I'm actually quite a very serious person too. And I like to learn new things.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I would always drift towards the self-help, the podcast episodes that you've probably been listening to, because I want to learn and hopefully kind of salt and pepper it with some sarcasm. It's very confusing. Podcast is quite confusing, but I also wanted it to be like an educational, inspirational, entertaining podcast. I just didn't want it to be two people necessarily just chit-chatting about shopping or what they had for, lunch the other day. It had to have some kind of like meaning behind the episodes.
It definitely does, which is why I asked you that, because when I first saw the title, I thought, well, especially when you say you kind of do a different take on sarcasm, change the misconception of sarcasm. And I thought, well, what does that entail? But like I said, the episodes that I've been listening to have been inspiring and entertaining and really appreciated, because especially the message today I was listening to was about motivation, empowerment. And I really like that coach. Now, you said Corey, she is a regular on your podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah, she's a friend. She's in the Bay Area as well.
Okay.
And she comes in for an episode a month, and she's a life coach. She did have her own podcast few years ago, but wasn't able to sustain it just because of, life always gets in the way. So then I just kind of pulled her in. I'm like, well, I know you want to do podcasting, but what if you just do it with me? You don't have to worry about all the back end stuff. And she has great wisdom to share. And we work really well together as far as creating an episode.
You do. And Coach Corey, shout out to Coach Corey. So let's go back to April 2021. And here in the US, we're in one of our many incarnations of COVID supposedly coming to an end. And you decide to launch Women Who Podcast magazine. What inspired you to launch at that time?
Well, I think it was the previous fall that the concept kind of came to me. It took a few months to wrap my head around having this idea. Because with me, when I get creative ideas, they just basically pop in my head. And then, okay, now what? And so, it takes me a few months to be like, okay, let's just marinate with this for a while. And then there are those times where I get a creative idea and then I'm very impulsive and I just do it without really thinking. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that, I need to think about things before just jumping and doing them. And when I was at Podfest Expo in 2020, it was my first conference, my first podcasting conference that I attended. And it was great. It was awesome. It was very inspirational. The people that I met were awesome. It was just an overall great experience. And while I was there, this magazine, the podcast magazine, was kind of floating around. And so I think I got a free copy in a swag bag or something. And so I looked at it and I was like, this is pretty interesting. I'll see if there's, if independent women podcasters are represented and how they're represented. And so a few months went by and I checked on their website and, I'm seeing like Katie Couric on the cover and all these celebrities on the cover. And I was like, well, that's unfortunate because I was hoping that this magazine would be more representative of independent podcasters, whether men or women. But I really felt that the magazine was not what I had hoped it to be. And so I'm kind of thinking about it and that creative thought comes into my head and it was like, well, you're just going to have to create a magazine yourself. And I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. I mean, in art school, we used Illustrator for a class in Photoshop. And that was my extension as far as using those software programs. And I'm thinking, okay, I can definitely attempt this. I've never published a magazine before. I didn't know what it entailed. But my friend Sandy, who is the podcaster for the Good Girl Confessional and also has this Women Beyond 40 empire in Australia, she had just published a magazine earlier in the year. And so I called up Sandy and I'm like, okay, Sandy, either talk me off the ledge and tell me not to do this, or you nudge me and push me off the cliff. And so, we're just talking about the magazine, and she's like, you really need to do this because there's nothing else out there. And I'm like, okay, shit. Do I really want to do this? So,
Careful what you ask
it was
for.
just all this back and forth in my mind of, okay, I don't even know what I'm doing. But I think talking with Sandy really helped me find the courage to be like, okay, we're going to do this because it's definitely needed in the podcast community for women podcasters. And so then April 2021 was our first issue.
The only reason I laughed when you initially said, should I do this? And every time, and I so relate to the ideas popping in your head and you just run with them. I've done that so many times. And as I've gotten older, I realize the wisdom of taking a beat, not to talk myself out of something, but to go, okay, everything takes time, energy, and money. Do I have those resources to give to this idea? And will it fulfill a calling or a need or a niche that I feel that it will? And if it does, then like you say, you find someone to help push you off the ledge and learn how to fly and learn the skills needed, which obviously you have. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to clarify the word independent because people can think of that in different terms. And as it relates to podcasters, given there are podcasters who monetize their podcast, but are still very much considered independent. Can you share what you're referring to when you say that your goal is to uplift independent women podcasters?
I think for me, the independent women podcaster is the podcaster that does everything. They book the guests, they record the episode, they edit the episode, they promote and market. And granted, there are podcasters that outsource one or two of those, and that's fine. But if the podcaster is doing like 95% of the work, and they have a day job, and they have kids, and they have a family, then to me, that's the independent women podcaster.
Thank you. Yeah, I check a lot of those boxes myself, so I can relate. And yet I know women who are independent, and yet they do outsource their show notes, they outsource their editing and what have you. And I still consider them independent when you consider the voices that you were referring to when you picked up that magazine. It does get, or it can get discouraging to think, well, how can I possibly come up against that? But one thing that I absolutely love about podcasting, and that's going to lead me into my next question for you, is that everybody does have a voice because there's always someone who needs to or wants to hear what you have to offer. So I'd love to know what you enjoy about podcasting.
I think it's just really cool to be able to talk to people, not only around the world, but talk to people that you wouldn't normally meet on the street or in the grocery store or at work. And you're able to give them a platform to tell their story or promote their book or, whatever they have to offer. And to actually ask them unique and not necessarily profound questions or personal questions, but you get to ask them questions that you're curious about. And, if the podcaster has to be curious about a person or a topic in order to even podcast. Because if you're not curious,
what's the point?
Then what's the point?
Yeah.
And it's not going to take you from point A to point B.
Yeah, I think just being curious in life and what you said about talking to people all over the world and in different cultures, just how they move about life. And I love your analogy of you wouldn't necessarily talk to them on the street or, maybe you would. I pretty much say hello to everybody and to the point where sometimes they cross the street. I'm being a bit facetious, but conversely, is there something really challenging about podcasting that if you could take that off your plate and never look back, what would that be?
I think, I don't know. I love all aspects of podcasting. Like I do my own editing, which I really love to do. I like doing the interviews. So I don't know that I would give up anything as far as the podcast goes, whether pre or post production. That's what I went to art school for. I mean, I took audio classes, I took video classes, and that's just things that I enjoy doing.
That's very cool that you said that because I enjoy doing it all as well. And had it suggested to me, Cheryl, why don't you outsource your editing? Why don't you outsource X, Y, and Z? And it's like, because I really enjoy doing all of it. Now, editing is time consuming, and we know that there's tools out there that can help us to streamline the process. But to me, that's part of the story arc. But I think you have to really trust an editor to know how your conversations go and make sure that it's presented in the way that you had them.
Mhm.
And that's a real finesse in finding someone who can do that. So let's go back to She Podcast Conference in 2021, because they had just wrapped an online one, I think a week or so ago,
Mhm.
a virtual one. You just launched your magazine in the spring of that year. What was it like for you to have been a podcast host and producer for over 3 years and then attend a podcast conference as a newly minted magazine publisher?
I think given that She Podcast was my second conference, I kind of knew somewhat what to expect from a conference. And so I went there a little more prepared. I've already met people within the podcast community at Podfest. So those same people that I met at Podfest were going to be at She Podcasts. And we're still friends. I mean, we're friends. We met at Podfest. We continue to be friends. So we were going to meet at the She Podcast Live conference. And so I think knowing people who are going to be at the conference already helped with going, because you're excited to see them in person again because they live in other states and you have that sense of camaraderie already established. And so it was exciting for me because I was speaking as well as trying to get the word out about the magazine. So I think that was really helpful in going to the conference.
One of the things that you said, and thank you for sharing that, because I couldn't agree more with your comment in your welcome address of your latest issue, when you say one common theme with all 22 women, in again, the women in your latest issue, is that regardless of the challenges they have faced, they are grateful podcasting has created a sense of community for them, whether it's the guests on their show, meeting other podcasters, or hearing from listeners. They love that they have created friendships with and through their podcast. And again, I couldn't agree more, because some of my most cherished relationships right now are with the women and a few men that I've met through podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very cool that we're simpatico with that, because it's really, truly, outside of voiceover, one of the most generous communities I've met. And I would love for you to tell our listeners, how often is Women Who Podcast magazine published?
It's quarterly, so it's 4 times
Okay.
a year. And we're getting started. We're working on our July issue. So that will come out probably the 3rd week of July. And we'll be featuring 7 podcasters. And what's really cool about the magazine and what I wanted to make sure is that it wasn't just about featuring the podcasters and telling their stories, but that there's other topic articles that are written by podcasters who actually are also writers to share their wisdom. And so you can learn not only about how other podcasters do their thing, but you can also learn tips and tricks or marketing strategies or imposter syndrome. Different resources are in the magazine as well as featuring podcasters.
I've touched upon imposter syndrome on my podcast before, and I think a lot of people are very familiar with that term. But in regards to podcasters, because podcasting is so individual, your voice, what you offer, Kathy, is individual. Your story, your history, etc., the lens in which you see life, that is so individual. I think it's so curious how people could have imposter syndrome, as I did before I launched in podcasting. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think for me, I don't know if this is with you. I don't know if you have like voiceover experience before you went into podcasting, but I was never behind the mic before. I was always behind the camera when I would do my short films because I preferred it that way. But I think a lot of women aren't used to being behind the mic, aren't used to hitting record or editing or promoting themselves or feeling confident in the stories that they have to tell. And so I think imposter syndrome is very common when you're trying to start something new that you know nothing about, because there are so many other people out there doing it that you think are pros from the get-go.
Yes.
But in reality, they're learning as they go just as much as the next person. I hope the magazine also helps with that too, for podcasters to read the stories of the featured podcasters, to be like, oh yeah, I'm not the only one that was so nervous to record our first episode that, it took me 500 takes to record it. Just to know that we're all in the same boat at one point or another, and you're definitely not alone in how you're feeling or how you're experiencing your first episode. I mean, that's a huge thing.
That's a unique perspective, too, because my imposter syndrome had to do with my message, if you will, which really wasn't mine. And when I realized that, it is about my guests and what they have to offer and what our energy together in the things that we talk about. And once I wrapped my head around that, I was more comfortable with that, because the tech part and the mic, all that wasn't my issue. It had more to do with like headspace and self-talk and all that other stuff. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that, because I forget, not everybody has been around technology or is comfortable with a mic, or like you say, editing and what have you. Because even people in voiceover, the pandemic made everybody have to put together a home studio. And if you weren't familiar with that, someone sitting down at a, editing software and trying to record themselves, they're like, what the heck? It's like learning to walk on the moon or something, really.
Yeah.
So, I know one of the key mantras of podcasters and podcast coaches or advisors is that you have to be consistent in releasing episodes. And I understand that you're currently taking a break from producing and releasing your podcast due to what is known in podcasting circles as pod fade. And for those who may be unfamiliar with the term, can you share what that is and why pod fade is real and necessary, and in your case, to take a break from our podcast from time to time?
Well, pod fade it usually happens pretty early on in someone's podcast career. It can certainly happen later on, but it's usually like within the first 1 or 2 years, because I think that a lot of us have the idea that, oh yeah, we just hit record, we say what we want to say, and then publish it, and then we promote it. And I mean, granted, if you're going to do that maybe a few times, then yeah, it's not a big deal. But if you want to be consistent and either do a weekly or bi-weekly, and even if you do it monthly, I don't think the frequency of the episodes is the key. It's, if you're going to do it every month, then do it every month. Don't do it 1 month and then 5 months later you're doing it again. So with pod fade, it's being that consistent publishing, promoting, creating every week or bi-weekly, and doing it for the rest of your life, basically, until you die. So, I was like that. I started in 2018 and I was doing it week after week after week. For 5 years, I did that.
Oh my gosh, God bless you.
And granted, I took a couple weeks off here and there, but it was never a month. And so when I decided to take a hiatus from Women Who Sarcast, it was a really tough decision, because after doing it every week for 5 years, it's like a piece of you is going to be missing. You have this identity crisis, basically, that, oh God, what if I stop for a month or 2 months? What are people going to think? What are listeners going to think? They're going to totally forget about me. And I think another thing that podcasters do when they first start is they focus on the download numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Which can drive you crazy. And it's important to know that data is there as somewhat of a view of how you're doing. But I think we focus too much and we rely on the download numbers way too much. And we become those download numbers. And if we're not doing as many as we think we should, then it's depressing. And then it's like, well, what am I doing this for if my download numbers aren't high enough? And so that's part of the pod fade too, is that you get down on yourself. You're not creating the listenership that you thought you were going to create. And I don't know about as far as feedback, if you get a lot of feedback, Cheryl, with your podcast, but a lot of us are just talking into an abyss. And we're not getting the feedback that we expect. We're not getting the engagement that we expect. So podcasting takes a lot of work, and just promoting it on social media is like a full-time job. And it is a lot of work. And I think after a while, after a few months, You have your day job, you have kids, your family. It all comes crashing down because it's just too much pressure. We put too much pressure on ourselves to perform at a certain level when it's only been 6 months in.
And I think that goes along with kind of the pressures of what other social media does as well, because as podcasters, you look at what other people who've been doing it for a long time, who maybe aren't even independent. They have a big machine behind them. There's a particular podcast that I'm starting to listen to that I really, really, really like. And at the end, she gives credit to about, a team of about 10 to 12 people. And so if you're comparing yourself to someone like that, well, it's like you said, you're talking into abyss. I heard once, I think maybe it was Jessica, one of the founders of She Podcasts. I think she might have said it that, podcasting is kind of like speaking into a toilet and flushing it because, you're just putting it out there and having no clue if anyone's listening. But to answer your question, I'm fortunate that two of my dearest friendships right now are from listeners who have been almost from day one listening to my podcast. And I will tell you that alone is so motivating for me because I don't get a lot of consistent feedback, but the ones that do, I know they've been there from kind of the start. And that alone, if what I and my guests had to offer meant something to them that day, then to me, that's worth it. And I'm curious in taking a break because I'll raise my hand over here. I have been one that have for a month or 6 weeks because of life or schedule, whatever, I haven't released an episode. Do you ever fear that maybe you will lose not your momentum, but your desire to go back to doing your podcast?
It definitely has crossed my mind. I mean, even now, and I've already scheduled when I go back to doing the podcast, I'm doing seasons. I'm getting smarter in my old age. So I'm definitely going to be a seasonal podcast when I start up again in August. And it'll be 4 months. So it'll be 4 guests, I think a total of 12, if I'm doing my math correctly, 12 episodes. And I've already got the guests scheduled. I've already recorded 1 episode for August. And I'm still going, okay, do I really want to continue doing the podcast? Because I think I have gotten to the point of burnout. At what point are you so burnt out that there's like a point of no return? And, that's kind of what I've done a lot of self-reflection about. But I still want to talk to people. And so I'm going to try this seasonal format and see if it's easier to bite off and chew than it has been for the last 5 years. And if it is, then I'll continue to do it. But I have to actually do the seasons first because I'm not going to just not try it. Like I'm not the type of person who's not going to try something and just call it quits. It's hard for me to call it quits, especially with creative projects and ones that I've enjoyed doing because I'm an overachiever and I'm a perfectionist. And that's a good thing in some areas. But sometimes you just have to be like, okay, I can't do this anymore. But that day hasn't quite come. So we'll see how the season goes and how I'm feeling after it. So I'll take a month off in December and then come back with another season in January. But it's, you have to continue to generate those topic ideas, the guest ideas. And, I'm only one person. Like I don't have a co-host to help me with that. So yeah, it's hard to continually generate those ideas. Although with ChatGPT, that might become easier. Who knows?
Oh gosh, that's as I've said it many, many times in this podcast and other forums. A tool is fantastic when it's used in the right way, and I will be exploring that myself. And I'm going to be looking to Capshow and some other things. There are ways to streamline our processes so we don't have the pod fade, especially when we're doing this on our own. And I appreciate you clarifying that it does usually happen at the beginning. That's why, what is the statistic that after 5 episodes, most new podcasters quit because they realize the amount of work that's involved in it. And even if you had a co-host, sometimes that can be more work. You have to make sure you're on the same page and who's going to do the editing, who's going to do all of the things. So it sounds like you have a game plan and that's really exciting. That's the thing. You make up your rules and how this works. I have an associate who she'll record an hour episode and release it in 2 parts. Whereas I record pretty much most of my episodes are an hour, and that's one episode for me.
Right.
You find what works for you. And I'm curious, what in the midst of all of what you got going on, and I am really so happy that we've met. I love your magazine. It's beautiful. You could
Well,
tell
thank
that
you.
your artwork and your background comes into play there because it's not like, here's your 5 pages and, thank you for looking.
Right.
And it's also affordable too. So please take a moment to plug your magazine, like how many pages in your recent issue, and I'll have this in your show notes also. How does someone go ahead and subscribe or purchase the recent copy, and how much is it?
Well, we just revamped the website. So we have a brand new
Yes, it's
website,
beautiful too. It's very nice.
womenwhopodcastmag.com. And the quarterly digital issues are $5.99. And the last issue was a second anniversary. The anniversary issues I try to make it huge just because I think it's important to celebrate. And so we feature, I think it was 13 podcasters for the anniversary issue. And we normally do 7 to 8 on the other issues. So it was 94 pages for the second anniversary issue, which is pretty big.
It is. Most printed magazines don't even, seriously, there's some trade magazines that started out several hundred pages and now they're about 75. And you're like, what is going on with publication? So that's a lot.
Yeah. And I try to keep it around 75 to 80 pages. I don't know why that number, it just kind of ends up that way between
And that's still a lot too.
The featured podcasters and the topic articles. And then the July issue will have 7 podcasters, like I said, and probably about 80 pages. But I think that's pretty decent for a digital magazine for $5.99.
It's very decent. Yeah, it really is. And I read that, when you're not sarcastic, which so far you've been just delightful.
I think there's different levels of sarcasm.
Yeah,
and I try to keep it, there's a fine line between being mean and being funny. So
I think when it's healthy sarcasm and
Yeah.
and fun versus, like you say, mean. But you like to cut digital film. You ride your e-bike around town and love being on the water with your stand-up paddleboard.
Mhm.
Is there anything else that brings you joy?
I really think advocating for other women has become a passion of mine probably in the last, 5 years. I think it's always kind of been there. But I don't know that I've actually been in the position like creating the magazine to really make a difference. I've always wanted to make a difference in my life, regardless of what it was, whether it's a documentary film or writing a book or whatever. I think it's important. I think we're all here to be of service to each other in one way or another. We're all called to do something, whether it's the podcast or to create a magazine or a book. And I just love helping other women take that first step in whatever podcast, a book, a painting. I feel like we need to support each other because may have been told growing up, well, becoming a writer doesn't pay the bills or becoming an artist doesn't pay the bills. And I think it's important that we all touch on our creative process. We're all creative. Some people say, well, I'm not creative. We all are creative. We just need to tap into what that means for us. And being able to have this magazine and showcase women podcasters that are making a difference. They are sharing their stories. They are having their voices heard. And for me, having low barriers to those resources, that's why the magazine is at a reasonable price. We have, for the featured podcasters, I've created a learning community. So once a month we meet and we have workshops, and it's a free monthly community. I understand that a lot of organizations or podcasting organizations charge for membership, and I understand the meaning behind that. But I really feel like for independent women podcasters, money is a barrier because they're not getting paid to do their podcast. They have families, they have kids, they have a day job. They don't need one more monthly expense. And so my vision is to have a learning community where podcasters can come freely. It's not a mandatory thing. It's just a casual learning experience, and it's free. because I want them to be able to get the resources and the information and the knowledge that they need to succeed. I think that should be everybody's goal in the podcast community, is to help each other out to be successful.
How does one become a member of that or join that?
Currently, it's for the featured podcasters and the writers.
Got it. Okay.
In the magazine. And the other thing I want to mention is that to be featured in the magazine, you don't need to pay a fee. There is no cost to the podcaster to be featured in the magazine. And normally, I reach out to someone or they fill out the Get Featured form on the website, and we feature you if you're within the criteria of an independent women podcaster.
What a fantastic opportunity you're providing. And I do believe you're already uplifting independent women voices. And I'm so appreciative of your time here, Kathy. Like I say, I was so delighted to come across your magazine and find out the work that you're doing. And I am wondering, in closing, if there was a soundtrack to your life, what would be on it and why?
Soundtrack. Oh boy. Well, I grew up in the 80s, so if that
I won't
tells
hold
you
that against
anything.
you. I won't hold that against you.
I listened to a lot of AC/DC growing up on the record player. I don't know. I think it's basically Freebird maybe, or, just kind of like go for it and take risks. And so whatever songs those are, listen to those, because we definitely need more people singing us encouraging songs of do what you want to do, take the risks. And what I like to say is, I'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission.
And on that, I will say thank you very, very much for taking time out of your very busy day and joining me on, I feel like I should have some party sounds or blowers or something, because this is very cool. It's very cool to meet a fellow podcaster and publisher and someone who is supporting women's voices, but is in the podcast space and cares as passionately as you do. And I wish you great success with your magazine. And I look forward to when we can cross paths again
Absolutely.
in person.
I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to talk with you. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I really appreciate all that you're doing for women in the podcast community.
I still feel like a kid in a candy store when I have a good conversation with someone. If it's a message to anybody out there and listening to Kathy's story and, what I've shared along the lines of, if you have an idea, it's called 19 Stories from Fear to Hope for a reason, because we can sit in our fear. And I think of that teacher who told you when you were in 7th grade about not being intelligent or smart enough. Take that voice and drown it out with all the goodness that is available to you through women in podcasts, through Women Who Sarcast, through the stories and voices of other women and men who are circumventing that kind of fear and that stuff from early on and chasing their dreams. So thank you, fellow dream chaser.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
You can be the outcast to be the backlash of somebody's lack of love. Or you can start speaking up. Nothing's gonna hurt you the way the words do when they settle near your skin. Kept on the inside and no sunlight. Sometimes a shadow wins. But I wonder what would happen if you
I'd also like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic. BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallbone, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Thank you again for joining me today. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at Cheryl Halling VO. I look forward to sharing more stories on the next episode of 19 Stories from Fear to Hope. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.